But all right, so let me get that recording started and set up. I know there's, again, is a small group. Welcome everybody, thanks for joining. So again, my name is Shimon, and I do a lot of things at the practice, but one thing that I have a lot of experience in is OCD, so I wanted to talk about that. So I know that people kind of either, listening to this now or are going to be listening to the recording later have varying degrees of experience with OCD, and that's totally fine. This was kind of designed as like a primer for treatment to kind of get a broad understanding of OCD, how we understand how it works, the rationale for treating it, and some other elements. So let's get into specifics. So the goals of this talk is, again, to present a kind of a background for OCD and anxiety treatment. And I put those two together for a specific reason. In particular, OCD is an anxiety disorder. A lot of times people who experience it kind of think that their thoughts are out of control and it's a thought disorder. That's actually not the case. It's an anxiety disorder and it works in our anxiety or fear system, which is really important, and we're going to get into that later. But one really important element to keep in mind is that anxiety has the same mechanism regardless of its presentation. So even though OCD is unique and it's a little bit different than some other presentations of anxiety, a lot of the principles that we're applying here and talking about here are going to be widely applicable, which I think is pretty cool and might be helpful. So we're going to discuss that. We're just going to discuss different presentations of OCD and how to tell if it might be a problem for you, if you should seek treatment or not. We're going to discuss how COVID-19 has impacted this process. In this world, it's kind of impossible to talk about anything without also talking about the impact that COVID is having on that experience. It's not the main focus of this talk, and at the same time, I think it's worth discussing. We're also going to offer some suggestions for how to manage that impact a little bit. And then what I'd really like to do is leave some time at the end to open it up to your questions and challenges that you've had in particular. Again, I know people on here have a range of experiences with either OCD or anxiety. COVID may have impacted people in different ways. So if there are things that I talk about and I leave out that have been part of your experience, I know it takes some courage to share those, but I think it would be really helpful if you share those as well at the end. All right. So let's get started. I'm actually gonna change my view for 1 second. There we go. All right. So if we're looking at OCD as an anxiety disorder, we have to start looking at anxiety in particular first. And in order to do that, we have to understand what the function of anxiety is. I think a lot of people come to treatment and they kind of voice this idea that they wish they didn't have any anxiety. Anxiety is terrible, it's really ruining their lives, they wish it didn't exist. And that can often be the case. And at the same time, anxiety is really important. If you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, we all developed to have anxiety for a particular reason. And I think it helps to notice that and be aware of it. So what is the function of anxiety? So number one, two things to consider. Number one, anxiety is anticipatory. It warns us that danger is coming. And it's super helpful and vital for survival. It's like an alarm bell ringing, telling you that there's a fire in the building, even before you see the fire. Without that warning of impending danger, you wouldn't be able to activate. So what the anxiety does is it activates that fight or flight. It gets us ready to go and get out of there. The other really important thing about anxiety is that anxiety is all about learning, and all about conditioning. If you think about it, babies or infants, toddlers have literally no fear. A baby will crawl into traffic if a parent doesn't stop them, right? Or someone else doesn't stop them. And that's because they haven't learned any danger yet. They haven't learned from these experiences. As we grow up, we have new experiences that trigger danger or discomfort. And then, we remember them and everything about them and are conditioned to respond in certain ways. So I actually thought there was just coincidentally this past weekend, I had a new instance of this. I don't particularly like spiders, not such a big fan. And I was at my in-laws' house in a room where I've been a million times. I was standing there and all of a sudden I see something in the corner of my eye and it's this like big brown hairy spider crawling. And immediately I have this anxiety response. I get tense. I step back. and I start kind of like, I see the spider crawl behind this cabinet. And then even though that spider crawled away, I was kind of checking for it. I start looking around for other spiders, like as if all of a sudden spiders are going to come crawling out of the walls. So I really started to have this fear reaction. And what was really interesting is that later on, so I left the room, I came back later, and I'm standing near the cabinet, and I didn't even realize it, but all of a sudden that image of that creepy brown spider pops into my head again, and I take a step back. And what that was is I've never had that fear response in that room before. But I learned a new fear response and association, and when I was standing there, my brain sent me those signals, watch out, there might be danger here. So that sort of conditioning happens all the time with our fear system, and it definitely takes place in OCD, which we'll get to in a minute. So why do we want this? Again, it's really vital for survival. It readies us for action. If you hear a siren, you immediately tense. If you're walking down the street and you hear footsteps behind you, you get ready to respond, or at least check to if there's any anxiety or danger around. On another more practical level, forgetting about life or death situations, you probably wouldn't function very well if you didn't have any anxiety. So I know for me, like I never would have made it through grad school without anxiety. I probably wouldn't have even prepared for this webinar if I had no anxiety. I just kind of wing it, which may not have been a good idea. But anxiety really prompts and motivates us. So it's super helpful emotion. At the same time, sometimes we don't want it, right? Sometimes the anxiety ends up ringing those alarm bells, but it's a false alarm. There's no real danger. And that's exactly what's happening with OCD. Your brain's telling you that you're in danger, even when you're not. And to take this a step further, you can feel that there's this danger, even though there's this logical part of you that knows logically there's no risk, there's no danger. At the same time, it feels very real and you feel very unsafe, and the OCD prompts you to respond to that. All right, so again, I know people may or may not have varying degrees of familiarity with this, but I think it's good to start off with some basic definitions. So OCD is an anxiety-related disorder characterized by the presence of either obsessions, compulsions, or both. Now, an obsession is any thought, image, or impulse that's unwanted, intrusive, or distressing. So I could be minding my own business, walking around my day, and all of a sudden I have this thought, what if I'm attracted to the wrong sex and I don't even know it? Or that can be triggered by something. I can see I'm male and I identify as male and identify as straight. So I can see a man, think he's attractive, and then all of a sudden have this fear, what if I'm attracted to the wrong sex and I don't know it? How can I be sure? Or I can be standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables and then all of a sudden have this image or this impulse of like losing control and harming somebody I care about. Those can be really scary, and those are both examples of obsessions. So when something like that comes up, we might do a compulsion. And a compulsion is basically any thought or behavior that's intended to reduce that distress. So a couple of points to consider when you're breaking this down. This includes physical behaviors like hand washing or avoiding, checking, a million other things. It also includes thoughts. So thoughts can be behaviors. And I know this can be a little bit new to think about because we think of thoughts as behaviors as things that we do physically, but thoughts can also be a behavior that you're engaging in and engaging in intentionally. So just as an example, when I say the word friend, the first thing that pops into your mind may be an image of a friend, a person, etc. So that thought is automatic. You can't really stop that. It just kind of happens when your brain processes the word friend. At the same time, if you start then thinking about who is that person, when did I meet them, when did I last see them, I wonder how they're doing, etc. You're then engaging in a process, and that's what we call behavior. And what's really, really key to note, and we'll get into this later also, is that behaviors are volitional. You can choose whether you want to engage in a behavior or not, even if it doesn't feel that way. So a lot of times people with OCD, you'll have these obsessions, they trigger this massive amount of anxiety, and it just feels like your thoughts run away and like are just kind of like a runaway train and start spiraling. That's very, very challenging to stop. And at the same time, part of the treatment is learning that you can change the way you're responding to that, which again, we'll get into. All right. Another important, so just a little bit more about compulsions. And I think it's important to emphasize this, is that compulsions really, really make a lot of sense. If I'm feeling a lot of discomfort and anxiety, I want to do something to deal with it. And compulsions are that answer. More importantly, compulsions work, right? They do reduce the anxiety, but only in the short term. So just going back to my spider in the cabinet example, I saw that spider. I started checking around after it crept away. I started checking around for other spiders. As soon as I saw there were no other spiders, I feel safe. My anxiety goes down. And that worked in that moment, but it only worked short term. Next time I went back into that room and I had that image again, I also took a step back because it didn't really last in any sort of meaningful way. So I kept responding to that false alarm. All right. So while it helps in the moment, you also have to think about the conditioning or the learning that's taking place. When I engage in a compulsion, I'm teaching myself two main things. So number one, that this fear is real. And then number two, the way I have to respond to this, I have to respond to this in a way that's going to keep me safe. Okay? And this applies throughout OCD. I once worked with somebody, and they had this fear of rabies, and they knew that like the odds of getting rabies were very small. They knew that you can only get rabies if you've been really like bitten by a rabid animal. They knew all those facts. Very intelligent person, and at the same time, even though they knew it, they were really worried about it. They were worried about that small chance, and the fear felt very real to them. So what they would do is they had all these compulsions around checking parts of their house to see if there was a rabid bat in their parts of the house. So one big area was the kitchen garbage can. So they would either avoid the kitchen garbage can, or they would go to the kitchen garbage can and check to make sure that a rabid bat didn't somehow sneak inside. Now, every time they do that, what they're reinforcing is, I check the garbage can, I see there's no bat. Okay, thank God I checked the garbage can. Now that's what's kept me safe. The reality is, though, if I ask any one of you, how likely is it that a rabid bat snuck into your garbage can in the middle of the night? You'd probably recognize that it's pretty small. But at the same time, every time I do it and there's no rabid bat, I reinforce that belief that I have to keep doing this, that this fear is real, there might be a rabid bat, and I have to keep doing this in order to feel safe. So, another really vital point. Behaviors are volitional. Compulsions are behaviors, and therefore they're volitional. And the way we're responding to our fears is really what's reinforcing and maintaining those fears. All right. So just before we move on, everyone doing okay? Especially there are only a couple of us on here, so I can check in with you guys, like a wave or a thumbs up or something. Still with me? Yeah. Okay. I got a chat from somebody. All right, great. Okay, love it. All right, so this cycle of OCD kind of plays out over and over again, and this is what it looks like. So you start off here. I'm going to use my little mouse to point. You start off here with an obsession. Obsession pops in that generates this increase in anxiety, which is really, really hard to manage and is also a false alarm. But it feels very, very real. So it generates an increase in anxiety. That's going to keep building until you do some sort of compulsion. And when you do that compulsion, again, short-term, effective, brings the anxiety down. But what you've done is you have two impacts of that. So number one, you've generated fear learning. I learn that this fear is real, and this is something that I need to do to stay safe. Another outcome of that, though, is hypervigilance. So after I saw that spider and I looked for the other spiders, I was done checking for other spiders. There was a time there when I could have sworn I felt tingling around my neck. I was looking around for shadows moving in the corner. I was super aware for a couple of seconds of the possibility of spiders. That tends to happen when you've reinforced this fear. And when that does happen, you're going to end up finding it. You're going to end up looking for and being super sensitive to when another obsession or something else that reminds you that fear is going to pop up again. And it's going to start this whole cycle all over again. So, as just an example, and this is Sam, totally fictional person. Sam's a 21-year-old Caucasian male living in Manhattan. Throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, he He's noticed an increase in thoughts about the illness and fears that he might contract COVID-19. Sam's mother had a heart condition, so he's concerned that getting COVID-19 will put her at risk. He has not been in contact with anybody who has COVID-19 and has no symptoms, but he still worries. He does his best to avoid contact with people, sometimes even skipping activities that he would like to attend. When he does go out, he finds himself constantly scanning, checking to make sure he's maintaining social distance. He wears a mask and gloves when he goes out, but still washes his hands for 5 to 10 minutes when he comes home just to be sure. Throughout the day, he finds himself wondering if he came into contact with anybody or if he has COVID-19 symptoms himself but isn't symptomatic. He frequently looks up symptoms and warning signs and often catches himself rethinking who he's been near and what he's done throughout the day. All right, so if you're going to apply this back to this cycle, what are the elements that you see in this vignette that show up in the cycle? And I'm actually gonna stop the screen share for a second, pop in with you guys, and maybe just ask people to chat me. You can chat me privately or chat the whole group if you see any of those elements in Sam's story. Any thoughts, any takers? I know audience participation is not fun in these situations. At the same time, better than listening to me talk the whole time. Obsession. Someone sees an obsession. All right, Megan, what's the obsession? Fear of getting COVID. Nice. COVID-19, awesome. Did anyone, Sam's obsessed with getting COVID? Great. Did anyone see any compulsions? Washing hands 5-10 minutes. Awesome. Looking up symptoms, another compulsion. Great. All right. You guys are awesome. Let's go back. And again, thanks for jumping in. All right. So just to break down that example, again, obsessions, right? So that obsession comes up. What if I touch something, someone has germs and I didn't realize it? Now I'm in trouble. That's going to increase anxiety. I don't want to get sick. I could get my mom sick too. It's going to generate a lot of anxiety, and that's going to build to a point where Sam feels like he has to do a compulsion. This will make me want to do something to reduce the anxiety and give it a sense of control, right? So like mentally reviewing, checking for symptoms, avoiding, washing hands. There are a lot of compulsions in there. And then there's that short-term decrease in anxiety that leads to that conditioning. I've learned how to respond when these feelings come up. And hypervigilance. Sam's constantly aware of feeling contaminated or of danger coming into contact with somebody. And that's why he's constantly checking. When he goes outside, he's constantly scanning his environment, etc. All right. And again, same sort of thing, just going through the same cycle over here. Okay. All right. So now that we see this kind of cycle and the cyclical nature of OCD, you keep reinforcing it, it's going to keep happening. We have to talk about like where we can intervene and how treatment or interventions look in reality. So there are certain parts of this cycle that are totally and completely beyond our control. I think it's really important to recognize that. Number one, you can't control thoughts that pop into your head, so obsessions. And that's really important. Obsessions are just your brain doing its best to keep you safe. When it sees something that reminds it of a fear, boom, that thought will pop in, and there's nothing you can really do to block it. In fact, if you try to block an obsession, what ends up happening is you tend to generate more and more obsessive thoughts. And the reason for that is because if you're looking for something as a threat, once you identify something as a threat, you basically become hypervigilant to it, like we said before. So if I say, don't think about something, I'm going to be looking for signs of that thing, and that thought's going to pop up more often. There's a famous example of this with a pink elephant. If I told you, no matter what, don't think of a pink elephant, you're going to think of a pink elephant. Right? Similar sort of idea. So you can't really control the obsessions, and it's important to realize that. You also can't control the fear response that initiates when you have an obsession. Right? That obsession becomes, if I'm worried that I might lose control and murder somebody, that is not a comfortable thought to have. I might have that thought, It might come into my head and make me feel nervous. That's okay. What you can do, however, is try to control your interpretation of that anxiety and your response. So remember, all of this, OCD triggers a false alarm in the fear system. So the goal is to recognize that the alarm bells that are going off are really a false alarm and not an indication of real danger. And then when you have that realization, you can choose to not engage in the compulsive response. And when we do that, when you have that feeling of anxiety and tension and you choose to not engage in it, that's called response prevention. You're preventing yourself from engaging in the response that would normally be the thing that makes you feel in control or safe. Not an easy thing to do. All right, so with this kind of rationale in mind and this process in mind, now we understand why exposure and response prevention is the gold standard treatment for OCD. And like I said before, any anxiety disorder is going to have some degree of exposure, or I should say any CBT for anxiety treatment is going to have some degree of exposure element. Other treatments, like something like social anxiety, would also have more of a cognitive component, but there's going to need to be exposure in play at some point too. So the goal is, if you can feel that the danger is there, you can recognize it as a false alarm and not engage in the compulsion. So the goal is really response prevention. Then you can break that cycle of OCD. And what happens in this case is the conditioning that you've had changes. Instead of fear learning, you get safety learning. This is another point that I think is really important and hard to adjust to. Let me just check. A couple of people sent in chats, so let me just stop for a second. All right, so someone's asking about symptoms of OCD. How do you find out how to compulsive behaviors of washing hands and wearing gloves? All right, we're gonna get into that a little bit, and we're gonna save some of those questions for a little bit later on, but thank you for asking. If I don't answer those questions throughout the course of this presentation, make sure we'll leave time at the end to discuss some of that stuff, okay? All right, so back to what I was saying. All right, so if you feel that there's this danger, but you can recognize it as a false alarm, then you can break that cycle of learning. And what's really important here is the idea that you can't erase the fear learning that you had before. And if you think about it, that's because emotions aren't logical. Forget about anxiety. If you have any emotion that you've ever had, if you try to tell yourself, I don't want to feel this way, just think for a second to yourself, does it ever work? You don't have to answer, but if I know if I've had, let's say, romantic feelings for somebody that didn't reciprocate them, I can try to convince myself not to feel those things, but I can do all the convincing I want, it's not going to change anything. It's especially true for anxiety also. I can tell myself, I know it's not a problem, I'm going to be safe, I'm going to be fine, but that fear still remains. The only way that you can address that is you can't get rid of it or erase that learning, but you can overwrite that learning. You can overwrite that fear learning with safety learning. And you do that through repeated and diverse experiences of triggering that anxiety response and then not engaging in the normal things that you believe keep you safe. So what's important here is that OCD wants you to think that compulsions are the things that keep you from harm or negative consequences. But the reality is that that's not the case. When the example I had before, the person that I was working with thought that checking the garbage can in their kitchen kept them safe from getting rabies from a bat. But the reality is there aren't that many bats in apartments in New York City. Certainly not rabid bats in apartments in New York City. So the thing that was keeping them safe was just the fact that that danger wasn't present, and the probability of running into a bat like that is so low. Same idea in this example. If I check the stove every time, 10 times a night, because I think that I have to check the stove or else my kitchen will erupt in flames, every time I check the stove, I learn that checking the stove is necessary to keep me safe. But the reality is that most stoves don't spontaneously combust. And if I can open myself up to that doubt, open myself up to that possibility of going to bed without checking the stove. So what happens is over time, I see that my stove doesn't spontaneously combust. The fear I always had wasn't as dangerous as I thought it was, and I can keep going. And I don't need to engage in the behaviors in the same way in order to stay safe. That's what we're going for in treatment. And if you look at this similar sort of cycle, but just playing out differently. So it starts the same way with the same obsession that pops into your head, totally out of control. You're minding your own business, and there it is. It leads to this increase in anxiety. If you can interpret that anxiety as a false alarm, prevent yourself from engaging in response, and make room for that anxiety, then it leads to long-term safety learning. You can recognize that those alarms don't make any sense, don't signal real danger. And I use this example of thinking of a fire drill, because we all know what it's like to hear a fire alarm going off in reality in school, and just kind of rolling your eyes and thinking like, oh my God, it's just another one of these things. When will it shut off? And the reaction we have is we kind of try to ignore it, we try to move on with our days without that sort of fear response. When you can recognize that the signals you're getting from your anxiety and your OCD is just a false alarm, you can change the way you're responding, even if it's still uncomfortable. All right, you guys still with me? Yeah, it's a lot. This whole process is a lot, but hoping you guys are still here. And again, if there are questions, awesome, thank you. If there are questions, I'm gonna check in on those later. All right, so some vital elements of ERP. Exposure and response prevention. So in order for this new learning to take place, you really need two things. So you need, number one, you need activation of fear. If you're afraid of needles, you can't really do an exposure without needles or some exposure to needles. If you're afraid of dogs, we need a dog, right? We need the things to trigger that anxiety, because that's where that learning takes place. In addition, you need information that's incompatible with the belief or the fear learning. So, meaning, if I'm worried that if I touch a needle, I might get AIDS. So what you need to do is you need to introduce you to needles, let you see a needle, hold a needle, touch a needle, and then not get AIDS. And when you see that and have that experience, and I can talk to you about it forever, but you need to go through that physical experience of learning that to overwrite that fear. And what's important to really note here is that exposures are designed to present you with the same amount of anxiety or danger that you would come across in day-to-day life if you weren't engaging in all these compulsions. What we don't include in exposures is something that would increase the anxiety. So in this needle example, I wouldn't go to a doctor's office, take a bunch of used needles and use those for exposures, because that would actually be introducing real risk. The point is instead to introduce you to that false alarm, and then see if you could tolerate that discomfort of not knowing. All right, and that last point about the presence of real or imagined danger is going to have an impact on COVID-19 and how it relates to this whole process. All right, so there's some components of the therapy which I think are really important just to give a brief overview of. And if some of you are in therapy or considering therapy, all this information will be described in more detail. But first is this idea of SUDS, so subjective units of distress. And what that is, it's a measuring system. It ranges from 0, meaning, so a SUDS score of 0 means no distress, no anxiety, totally fine, to 100, which is the worst thing you can imagine, the highest anxiety you can imagine. And we use SUDS to kind of organize a treatment plan. So SUDS are used to identify exposures, how much anxiety they generate. And the goal is to do different exposures and present different levels of anxiety organized by your SUDS scores. And there are different types of exposures too. There's in vivo exposure, and this is really kind of the bread and butter of what we do in OCD treatment, and what usually has the most impact in treatment is when you actually, in real life, you confront the thing that you're afraid of. So you actually go to a public restroom and touch a sink or a counter. You actually touch a needle. You actually touch a subway pole, any of those things. Sometimes though, the SUD scores for in vivo, for doing some of those things are way too high. It's too high to start with. Someone's not willing to engage in that right away. So we might start with something called an imaginal exposure. And there are a couple of reasons why we do this. So one is that the thing that you're afraid of is either too threatening right now, so we want to start with imagination, or it's not practical, right? If I'm afraid of going to hell, then, and my OCD centers on the idea that I might go to hell, obviously there's no way I can do that and take you there in reality because it's not possible, right? So we would do imaginals about that. We would imagine what it's like, sinning and leaning into the idea that maybe you would go to hell for this, or imagine what going to hell, you could imagine dying and being in hell and what that's like. And that would probably be a higher order on your SUDS score. But all those are fair game for imaginals, and it's going to be a very helpful tool for that. The other idea, or the other way that imaginals can be helpful, is you can imagine yourself, you can expose yourself to the idea of the worst fear happening without it actually happening. So I've worked with a number of people that have OCD related to fear that they committed a crime or going to get in trouble. So we do a lot of imaginals about imagining, the police coming to their house, getting arrested, spending their lives in jail. Obviously, those aren't things we can actually play out in a session, but we integrate imaginals into that too. Over time, the idea of those things happening becomes easier to live with. So you might still have those thoughts come up, but if you've done 100 imaginals of going to prison, so then suddenly when you have this fear thought come up, this obsession pop into your head, what if I go to jail? It doesn't trigger as much response, or even if it does, you know that you can have that anxiety and move on. Another important component is that you can also learn that you can imagine something and it doesn't make it real. A lot of times people have OCD thoughts that, if I think that harm is going to come to somebody, just thinking the thought might make it actually happen, or I'm not sure if it could make it happen. So we use imaginals in situations like that as well. Next is another component which we've touched on before is response prevention or ritual prevention. And this is that once you're already in a situation where you're feeling that anxiety, you're going to want to do compulsions, you're going to want to do rituals. And the goal is not to hold yourself back. And what's really important is that response prevention applies all the time, which is a little bit different than exposure. So just to create that distinction, if I'm working with somebody and I'm doing exposures around the theme of contamination or fear of getting sick, so we would do things like touching a doorknob in a public place, touching a pole on a subway, etc. And we would practice that in session. And you would practice the exposure and response prevention. At the same time, that same person may then go home and bump into a wall and not know who's touched it and have those same sorts of compulsions triggered and those fears triggered. The response prevention applies there too, even if it's a situation we didn't practice. And the ability to do that really generates like a broader learning of how to apply these skills to new situations. Okay, another idea is that we want to correct challenging or erroneous thoughts. So we challenge beliefs, like for example, if I think that if I don't check locks 7 times, or if I don't check the stove, someone's going to come in and murder my family, and we try to challenge that and test that again in varying degrees. Other types of exposure, which may be relevant, but are usually not as directly relevant, so just good to know about. Something called interoceptive exposure, that's exposure to physical symptoms, usually more relevant to somebody with fear of panic attacks. And virtual reality, which can be really helpful, but a lot of clinicians and practitioners don't have the resources for it. But if I do have access to virtual reality, so then I can go through virtual reality situations for a lot of things that I would have used imaginals for. So like virtual reality scenario of being in hell, something like that. All right. There's a lot of subtypes of presentations of OCD, and I'm not going to spend so much time getting into this because we're a little short on time, and I want to leave room for questions. But one important idea is that in OCD, we don't care as much about the content of the thoughts. We care a lot more about the process. Every OCD thought, every obsession is going to trigger that same sort of cycle. Obsession, anxiety, compulsion, fear learning, reduction in anxiety, and fear learning. That process happens regardless of what the obsession is about, right? And a major theme is that obsessions and compulsions are often aimed to reduce and clarify doubt. So a lot of these questions are, how do I know for sure? How do I know for sure that I won't, for example, sorry. How do I know for sure that I won't harm other people? How do I know for sure that I'm not attracted to animals or a family member or children or something else? All of those thoughts that pop in and are scary. So, and the reality is you don't know for sure. So that's going to trigger that fear. Okay. Idea of violating a crime is another one. I'm going to go through these real quickly just to give you an idea of what they are. But again, I'm going to send these slides out, or have the practice send these slides out to anybody that wants them or that signed up for the webinar, and then you can reference these more then. So sexual orientation, doubts about that, doubts about relationships, etc. Contamination is a big one. We've been talking about that a lot. And there are others that are more focused on presenting as behaviors. So checking, hoarding can be related to obsessive thoughts and fears. Symmetry, or the need to have things in a certain order or just right. A lot of times people will repeatedly do something until it feels right. I've worked with somebody who has this idea that they need to keep eating until they get like the perfect last bite of food. And a lot of times that can be really distressing, because that threshold of like what's considered the right bite is very, very hard. And there's lastly is just this one idea that I want to touch on called pure O. A lot of times people think that there's this idea that I don't have any compulsions, I just have obsessions. So I just have my whole OCD presentation is mental. I think there's, and I'm sure people disagree with me, but I think this is a little bit of a misnomer, because again, if you have an obsessive thought and then you're engaging in mental compulsions to try to address it, it's still a mental, and it's still the same process of obsessions and compulsions. So it's the same mechanisms at play. It's just playing out internally as opposed to externally. All right. Now, to address some of the questions before, how do you know when to get treatment, and what are some factors to consider? A lot of times people can have OCD symptoms that don't really get in their way. So the biggest factor to consider when deciding if you want to pursue treatment or not is impairment or interference. In other words, are the obsessions and compulsions getting in the way of how I want to live my life? Are they impacting me? If I like know that I'm going to be late to work if I keep washing my hands, and at the same time I feel like I still need to wash my hands, I still need to take a shower for an hour and a half, those things are getting in the way. And this kind of leads into one of my biggest pet peeves about OCD, is when people say like, they're describing being neat, and they say like, oh, I'm so OCD, I'm really neat, everything's in order. That's not OCD. If you're having these obsessions and compulsions and they're generating real impact in your life and interference in your life, that's a time to seek treatment. Another indicator is control. So how much control do you have over these urges to engage in compulsions? Can you push them back? And if you can't, or it's really hard, you feel like you need to keep eating until you get the right bite, you try to stop and it just feels too uncomfortable and you have to keep doing it, that's an indicator that treatment might be necessary. Another is urgency to respond to obsession. So we all have intrusive thoughts. We all have anxious thoughts. If those anxious thoughts come up and they feel like they really need to be addressed immediately, that's again another indicator that you're having obsessive thoughts that should be addressed. All right, so just a couple more minutes on COVID, and then we're going to open it up to questions if there are any. So challenges with COVID. So number one, there are a lot more limited opportunities for exposure in some ways. So again, the idea of an exposure is to open you up to a degree of anxiety, but not one that's going to present real danger. So if I'm doing contamination phobia and I'm having you touch a subway poles in general, full of germs, you're definitely opening yourself up to some doubt and discomfort. Maybe you'll get sick. And at the same time, I wouldn't ask you to lick a used Band-Aid or touch a used needle, because those would be introducing actual threat and actual danger. The challenge with COVID is that now touching a subway pole isn't really as safe or as standardly unharmful as it once was. Touching a subway pole may generate real risk, and the CDC tells you that when you do that stuff and you go home, you should be washing your hands or using Purell. So again, that limits what's kind of considered fair game for an exposure. Another thing is response prevention. So normally, if we were doing the subway pole exposure, you and I would go to a subway, hold the pole, and then afterwards, I'd have you, take your hand, rub your hands together, touch your face, touch your cell phone, touch your bag, and really spread that that potential contamination around to really embrace that fear and that doubt. In a situation like this, number one, I wouldn't ask you to do that. Number two, when you would go home after an exposure like that, eventually you may shower or have to wash your hands. And in treatment, that would work under certain guidelines. But if you do shower, which we all should at some point, you would end up recontaminating or re-exposing. So let's say you take a shower, but then you touch your cell phone again and you lean into the idea that maybe I'm still contaminated again. If we're dealing with COVID-19 though, we wouldn't want you to reintroduce to something that could potentially pose a real threat. So it can diminish the lasting impact of an exposure because an exposure is only going to last until you end up having to take that shower or end up having to do the Purell. You're also going to get mixed messages from family members. Often treatment family members can make treatment a little bit more challenging sometimes because they can either accommodate the compulsions or provide reassurance, which is a major compulsion. Now, however, family members might, give totally different messages, mixed messages. They may be encouraging you to wash your hands more and engage in more of the behavior. So you can say, my therapist said I should only do X, Y, and Z, and family members are telling you, like, you're crazy, you have to keep washing, etc. So that can be very challenging to navigate too. The other big problem is COVID opens us up to a lot more doubt. You're opening yourself up to doubt about a lot. And there's a lot of doubt in the world right now about what's going to happen in schools, will there be a second wave, etc. So you have all this doubt surrounding you about COVID, if you're going to get COVID, what the impact is going to be, etc. I had a colleague that compared it to doing like a group project in school because you can be putting in A+ work and doing whatever you can to protect yourself from COVID, wearing a mask, using Purell, etc., social distancing, but other people around you could be doing C work or C- work, and you don't really know. So there's a lot of doubt about that, and that can be especially hard for everybody. That can be hard for everybody, but especially hard for people with OCD. Another factor is there can be perceptions of loss in progress. So people who've done some OCD work, or can feel like they're backsliding because now all of a sudden you're washing hands more, you're checking for social distance more, or people who've never had these sorts of compulsions can all of a sudden start thinking, wait a minute, I'm washing my hands. Is this compulsive? Is this indicated? How do I know? And that can be really problematic too, because it creates this gray area between what's considered compulsive and what isn't. And again, that's just another thing that's challenging to navigate. On the other hand, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out that there are some favorable opportunities for treatment that come about with COVID. So if we're all doing treatment remotely, there's a lot more impact for opportunities for impactful exposures when you're at home. For instance, if you're afraid of exposures around your dog, let's say, so if in a normal course of treatment, you'd come into therapy with me, you'd come into the office, most of the time you wouldn't be bringing your dog with you, and we'd be doing imaginal sorts of exposures. The fact that you're in your home, you can grab your dog, use your dog specifically for an exposure, so you can have a real impact that's very important. Another thing is that the idea of OCD is a lot of times in exposure, we want to be able to open yourself up to doubt, open yourself up to the idea that you're not sure if a feared consequence is going to happen. With COVID, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, there's a lot more doubt out there, and that can be really, really hard to navigate. And on the other hand, it also leads to a lot more opportunities to open yourself up to doubt, which is essential for treatment in general. So I think there's, not that it makes it better, but there is a little bit of an opportunity there. So in terms of some guidelines or some approaches for how to respond, number one, creating guidelines for yourself. Follow CDC guidelines, but no more. When you come home and you wash your hands, You wash your hands for 20 seconds with soap and hot water, whatever the CDC says, but the OCD isn't going to be satisfied. The OCD is going to tell you you need to keep washing, you need to wash for 5 minutes, etc. If you're washing hands above OCD guideline, above CDC guidelines, then you're engaging in a compulsion, and you should pull back from that. So relying on guidelines is one approach that can kind of clear up a lot of this. And trust me, the OCD will push for more, and there'll be plenty of room for response prevention. The other approach is just trying to open yourself up to acceptance. So again, OCD hates doubt, but that same challenge offers more opportunities for exposure, for embracing doubt and discomfort. In other words, it's more potential to implement principles of treatment and response prevention. And similarly, reframing. So looking at this, you know, when you're doing what you need to do to stay safe, if you're following CDC guidelines, it's not a lapse in progress. It's not slipping back in treatment. Instead, you're adapting ERP principles to new and more challenging situations. And that's really important. In fact, that's an indicator that you're learning the skills and the principles that are necessary for treatment if you can start applying them in new ways. So just to review, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions. We've covered OCD and our understanding of it. We talked about the rationale and the basics of treatment. We've talked about some challenges from COVID and some ways to respond to those challenges. And one thing that we mentioned a couple of times that I want to emphasize is that OCD comes in a lot of different presentations, but we focus on the process over the content. It's not really about the specific thoughts. It's the same process at play all the time, which is really why it's important. And this is a little bit of a plug for a project that I'm interested in starting, why group therapy for OCD can be tremendously helpful. It's something that can allow for other people to be supportive in the practice of practicing exposures, understanding exposures. It can create a community within treatment, and it can help everybody learn how to apply treatment principles to broader skills in real life. So with all that said, I'm going to stop the screen share right now, open this up. Any thoughts or questions about any of this? I know this has been a lot. Okay, some questions coming in. I'll do my best to address these. So I'm having fear of contamination. I'm washing my hands and body parts for a longer time. How to convince myself that my hands are not dirty anymore, how to overcome intrusive thoughts. Can I manage this on my own before going to a professional for help? So again, that's a great question. So it sounds like since COVID, you're having more fears and more thoughts about this contamination being there and spreading. So I would really go back to those guidelines in terms of, can you stick with CDC guidelines and try to move on from those thoughts? If you notice those thoughts are there and they're still prompting, those thoughts can be there, those thoughts can come up, but if they're forcing you to engage in certain behaviors, that's where you want to veer away. So if the thoughts are telling you you need to wash more, you need to shower more, or shower for longer, try to push back. See if you can set, so one recommendation is to see if you can set a guideline of only showering for 5 minutes most, only washing your hands for 20 to 30 seconds at most, and see if you can push back on that. If you find that that's really hard, that might be an indication that you may need some more help. Hope that answers your question. Another one that came in, can your nature of achieving perfection in everything you do be called OCD? OCD and perfectionism have a very, very big overlap. So yes, there's a lot of overlap there. We didn't really have time to discuss that here, but the idea that everything needs to be perfect or everything needs to be just right can definitely follow this process. On the other hand, perfectionism has its own sort of mechanism involved. And it's funny that you should ask about that. Another webinar I'm thinking about presenting has to do with perfectionism, so kind of watch out for that. But yeah, I know that's not really answering your question, but short answer is yes, it's possible. Broader answer is it's hard to tell without speaking more about whether perfectionism is at play or OCD is at play. Someone else said, what's helped me with the checking OCD is to make a checklist and check off things I've already done. If the thoughts come up again, I look at my list to reassure myself that I've already done it, and it's helped me not to repeat those actions. That can be very helpful. In some ways, it can also be a little bit compulsive if you feel like you need to continue to follow through this checklist in order to stay safe. So, when you look at that checklist and you say to yourself, oh, I've showered, check, I'm safe. I've washed my hands, check, I'm safe. If you feel like you need that reassurance to remind you that you're safe, that can be a compulsive too. So again, in principle, a lot of these things can be easier to understand, but in practice, a lot of them can be a little bit challenging to tackle one by one. So that's another reason why consulting with somebody may be helpful. Again, if you feel that there's a degree of impairment. Okay, we are about out of time. Any other last questions, thoughts? Okay. Thank you everyone for participating. My contact information is on the slides. If you have any questions after this, do please feel free to email me. I think also I really liked this idea of getting an OCD group started. If that's something that piques your interest, I think it would be a good supplement if you're in treatment or you're considering treatment. Joining a group and doing that process together may be helpful. If that's something that interests people, let me know. Otherwise, that's about it. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a good day. Okay, bye.